Great, welcome to Geography 102. Just our introduction to get us started. First, a cute little um, picture here. Just if we think about the world, it kind of looks like a cat playing with Australia. So we'll be talking about 10 different regions as we go through this course. So in chapter 1, just kind of looking at what geography really is. Our learning objectives, talking about the principles of geography, some of the physical and human features, the different types of regions, and then also talking about globalization and some population dynamics as well. So what is geography? Usually whenever we think about geography, first of all, literally it means geo, earth, graphia is to write, so writing about the earth. So it's really the study of lands, which is usually what most people think about, is just where everything is. But this course, we will be looking at that, but also it goes deeper than just knowing where everything is. So it looks at some of the features, who's living there and why. So cartography, which is, again, just where everything is on a map, but also lots of other things. So there are many, many sub-disciplines in geography that we'll be talking more about. So if we look at physical versus human geography, so there's actually a separate course called Human Geography that gets offered occasionally. So physical is more what we're focusing on, which is, just the spatial distribution of plants and animals, so where everything is located. Looking at climate or climatology, so the temperature, the rainfall, geomorphology, which is the topography, so mountains, deserts, different types of topography. Whereas human geography is looking more at the culture. So why are people where they're at? Not just where are they, but why? What's their culture like? And also the population geography or demography, which is where those populations are located within a region. So we'll actually be covering both of these throughout the semester, not just one or the other, but we'll include kind of all of these in our regions. So again, our course is going over climate. We're talking about physical features, again, mountains, lakes, rivers. We'll talk about the culture in most of our regions, the economics. Again, don't probably typically think about that with geography, but the geography and the layout of the land heavily impacts its economy. The politics also, because that kind of goes back to those, they can be more of a political source based on their resources or their history. So we'll be looking at all of these, again, not just where everything is, but what are these regions like? So again, the synthesis of the physical world and human activities at the heart of regional geographic approach, which is what we are focusing on. That's what your textbook approaches. So geographers want to know not only where things are, so where the different countries are, but also why. Why are people located here? Why is their culture like this? Why is their economy like this? So for example, it's not just knowing which countries are part of the European Union, but also why are they there, or why aren't they part of that? So there's a neat little video here you can click on and check out if you want to. Just kind of goes through what geography is and some of the different subdisciplines. So if we look at spatial perspective, this kind of relates to the where of our primary question. So there are a few different ways of looking at where. So relative, so this would be like my house is close to Sheetz. Doesn't tell you exactly where it's at, but it is relative to something that is more well known. An absolute, this is where latitude and longitude comes into play. So real quick, in case it's been a while, latitude are the vertical lines, longitude are the horizontal lines. So our college, the Potomac State College campus anyways, is 39.4409 degrees north and 78.9739 degrees west. So that is an absolute, very specific location. And then there's also the geographic information systems. This is more digital data that uses computers to kind of look at and manipulate different spatial data. So again, just a quick recap of latitude and longitude. Again, the vertical lines would be our latitude, and then longitude are going to be our horizontal lines. So again, if we're looking at absolute perspective, those are always given in degrees based on the equator being 0 as far as our longitude. And then again, our latitude is also our prime meridian, is essentially the equator for latitude. So our locations as far as core and periphery. So again, some relative spatial perspectives. The core is typically the central business district. This is going to be our cities or urban areas. So they're densely populated, whereas the periphery, the suburbs or the rural areas, also called hinterlands. Again, those rural areas that are more sparsely populated, but they typically interact with each other. So for example, the hinterland or the periphery often makes raw materials. So we think about farming that feeds the many that are living in the urban areas. So those raw materials are made more in the hinterland, but they're sold in the core. So it's usually a symbiotic relationship. They need both. They both offer advantages to each other. And again, just kind of looking here, again, our hinterland, those rural, we're thinking about farmland, or here, grazing cattle, our city that helps provide the milk and meats for those areas, also our crops. But again, they provide resources, but the city provides a place to sell those resources as well as to exchange goods. So if we think, though, about more the global core and periphery, so that's really in a region, but if we think about worldwide, our global core would be the more economically kind of powerhouses. So if we look at this map here, so our core, so of course, North America here, also Europe, very important, Oceania, which includes Australia. Over here, our Asian partners. So again, these are our core kind of areas worldwide or globally that provide a lot of that industrialization. Whereas the periphery, as far as globally, more areas like Russia, Africa, and most of South America. This is more, again, supporting those core areas. So some of our physical settings, this typically we'll be thinking about like mountains and lakes, but also plate tectonics. So just a little bit about how these work. So the Earth is essentially broken into these rigid plates because originally all of the land was in one big mass of Pangea, and then over time it's separated. So those plates float or kind of move. So lots of geological actions occur at the boundaries. So where these, and that's what these black lines here are showing. So where these plates come together, this is typically where you're going to see a lot of activity. So like earthquakes, hurricanes, that type of thing. Also mountains forming. So that's where things are really active. In the middle, so we think about this plate going all the way around. Here in the middle, these are less likely to experience those activities like earthquakes or volcanoes. So the shape of the Earth is that topography. So again, that's one of the subdisciplines of geography. So we'll be talking about tectonic plates in each of our regions. And these plate boundaries, so again, where these plates come together, there are different types. So a divergent plate boundary, these move apart relative to each other. So a diverging or separating. And these are prone to earthquakes and volcanoes, but also new land or crust forming. Then convergent. So these are coming together. Again, earthquakes and volcanoes happen there, but also our mountains result from those. And then finally, our transformed. This is where they actually move past each other. So they don't just collide against each other, but they actually slide over top. And this is where a lot of earthquakes can occur. And this is just showing those different ones. So again, convergent, these are coming together. They're converging there. The transform, so this one is actually over top of the other one. Or again, so we have all of these different types that lead to different geological activities. Now, if we look at some other physical settings besides the plate boundaries, our climate. So this is essentially, we have weather, which are short-term variations. So tomorrow it's going to be sunny. Climate, though, this is more long-term. So the average rainfall, so 30 or more years of kind of averaging temperatures or land, like rainfall in an area. So climate change is something we'll hit a lot on in our different regions, but this is mainly, not completely, but mainly due to human activity and the burning of fossil fuels. So the release of carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas. We'll also talk about methane, which comes from mainly from our agriculture or from our farm animals, so sheep, dairy, cattle, meat cattle, that release that methane. So greenhouse gases are good. They keep our planet warm. That's their job. That's why we can live on Earth, is because they trap the heat from the sun instead of just letting it diffuse away. Unfortunately, as those gases increase, they're causing the planet to warm more and more and more. And so that's leading to, you may have also heard of, global warming. So just an increase in temperature over time that is causing a lot of climates to change, getting hotter, cooler, more extreme weather. So again, we'll talk more about that throughout the different regions. Then if we look at the human setting, so we know where our climate is, which is the rainfall and the temperatures, all that good stuff. But one control of the location is the climate. So that definitely impacts where people live. Typically, the most dense populations live in relatively warm areas that aren't too dry. So they get some rainfall, but not too much rain. That's where we're going to find them. So oftentimes close to water that you'll see here. Of course, on our coast, we talk about the east and the west coast in North America. So again, that's based a lot on those climates. Also, these population dynamics. So the 10 most populous cities in the world are developing countries. So this suggests that developing countries have higher rates of population growth. So usually urbanized or industrialized nations or regions, typically the birth rate actually is lower. So they're more work oriented, so the population is actually smaller. Whereas areas like in Africa, where they are developing, as we see here on our map as it's growing, this is where more and more of the populations are growing, are the developing countries. So there are some different dynamics and terms that go along with this. So the rate of natural increase, RNI, this is the birth rate minus the death rate. So it's positive, meaning the population is increasing. There are more births than deaths. It's negative when the population declines, so more people dying that are being born. But this does not account for immigration. So people coming in or leaving, just they're not dying or being born, but they're just moving locations. Then we also look at population dynamics based on the fertility rate. So this is the average number of children born to women in their childbearing age. So in America, it's like 1 point something. So most families have around 2 children. So that's the total fertility rate. So if it's greater than 2, then the population is increasing. If it's less, then it's steady or typically declining. And then also we'll spend some time here talking about this demographic transition model. So this is looking at the changes in all of this. So the changes in birth rates and death rates and the population growth over time as a country is developing. So more here about this population dynamics. Again, study of the populations and how they change over time. These mathematical models that look at different things like the amount of people, ages, age range, the ratios of gender and sex, religion, politics, etc. Picture here to the right, so Thomas Malthus came up with this idea, kind of termed it, and again, this demographic transition model that we just mentioned shows the shifts in characteristics, and there are 5 stages that we're going to go through here in just a minute. But again, population, geography, one of the other subdisciplines that we have is just looking at again, through a spatial lens, looking at that demography or the study of population composition. So how many men, how many women, Christian versus Muslim, Democrats versus Republicans, anything like that. That's all looking at the idea here of population geography. So some of these characteristics, again, some terms. So we have the crude birth rate. So this is the number of children that are born every year, and that's per 1,000 people. Then the death rates, same, just the number who die per year. Again, this is per 1,000 people. Also, a lot of times we'll look at infant mortality, and that's just the number of children who do not live past their first birthday per 1,000 people. This gives an idea of typically longevity, healthcare, things like that, food resources. So again, oftentimes, especially if you think about some of the underdeveloped countries like Africa, the crude birth rate may be really high. Lots of babies are being born all the time, but a lot of them don't live past their first birthday. So the population dynamics isn't changing a whole lot because of that. And then life expectancy, just the average age in which the population is expected to. Right, so here's our demographic transition. Again, the 5 stages, we'll go through them individually, but just to kind of see them all on one slide here. So the most underdeveloped would be our stage 5. And then as we moved into more and more developed populations, then we reach up to stage 5. So we'll look here at the total population. So we see as we move through the stages, that population is highest whenever we get to stage 5. But doesn't necessarily mean that there's an increase or decrease in the overall number. So again, that's looking here at the ratio of the birth rate to the death rate. So looking at the first 2 stages, so here in stage 1, you can see that both the birth rate and the death rate are really high. That means that there's really little population growth because, again, there may be many babies being born, but again, also a lot of death due to disease and etc. So this is typically due to either low contraception use, so again, lots of babies being born, no birth control, that type of thing, but also high infant mortality that also leads to a high death rate. So again, lots of kids being born, not a lot surviving. So that can be due to poor sanitation, poor diet, not a lot of resources. And then as we moved into stage 2, so here we still have that high birth rate, but now the death rate is starting to fall. So they're starting to live longer. So that's going to lead to a rapid increase in that population because, again, lots of people being born, not a lot dying, huge increase in our population. So this is where, again, not a lot of contraception, but we still have good food, we have lots of water, good diet and sanitation. So that infant mortality starts to decrease. They start surviving to a longer or to a greater age. So then in 3 and 4, this is where we start to get into our more developed countries and populations. So the population is increasing. Both the birth and the death rates are falling, but the death rate is falling more slowly. So we're still seeing an increase, but that increase starts to slow down because the birth rate is starting to slow down. And this is typically where we start to see an increase in education, usually indicates some more contraception, less, again, the birth rate is declining, not having as many kids due to that family planning. Also mechanization of labor. So again, some of the populations that are in stages 1 and 2, they're having children to help support the family. So thinking about like farming and agriculture, whereas once that isn't needed, now there aren't as many children that are needed to support the family. Then as we move into stage 4, we can see both the birth and the death rates are low. So that means that we kind of have a stable or kind of falling population as it starts to level off there. This is due to good food, also lower disease rates. So again, that death rate is falling, but also we have the lower birth rate due to the same things we just talked about in stage 3. All right, and then our last stage, this is going to be kind of the most debatable. So typically the birth rate and the death rate are still kind of low. Here, maybe the birth rate is starting to increase just a little bit, and the death rate is kind of slowly declining. So we kind of have a stable population here, and this is mainly due to an aging population, so where we have a much older population. So kind of Europe is in this stage, the United States is more in the stage 4. But again, we start to see some of these older populations or older communities. Just a few limitations to the demographic transition model that looks at those. So it cannot predict the future. It just kind of shows kind of the history or where we're at currently in a population, but it doesn't account for a lot of things. So such as disease events. So we just, of course, went through COVID not that long ago, but different pandemics doesn't account for those types of changes. People moving, so immigration, so people coming in or leaving, and it also assumes a few things. So it indicates a linear process. So we're moving from stage 1 to 5, not kind of moving back and forth. Doesn't indicate, beliefs or needs or how that impacts the population, or looking at the economic or industrial side of things versus the social side. So it's mainly just based on resources being available, not so much social interactions, thinking about like biases and various aspects that go along with that, like religion or things like that can impact the growth, or again, that immigration or people moving in to the population. All right, so if we switch to the different regions that we're going to be looking at, we can kind of look at regions in a few different ways. So formal regions here are homogeneous. These have at least one characteristic that they share in common. So for example, plant hardiness zones, that's one way of dividing up regions, is based on how well plants survive. So they share, again, what types of plants given that are in that given climate. We also have functional regions. So this is united by a function. So typically it's going to be the economy. So for example, the LA metropolitan area. So this is a region, and it's a functional region because it's based on their economy. They're all using that same kind of urban economy model. So this includes the areas beyond the city limits. So again, part of that hinterland that we're talking about here, not just the city of LA. So these don't necessarily share any of the characteristics like the formal regions. Again, they just function together as a unit. And then the vernacular regions, this is what we are mainly going to kind of focus on for our course. So this is based on different perceptions. So for example, the South or the North, so there's not an exact boundary for that. So it differs by people. So, we're in West Virginia. Some consider West Virginia to be part of the South, others the North. So again, this is kind of more perception based versus a specific boundary. So again, not as well defined as these formal and functional regions. So the 10 regions that we're going to be looking at in this course, so we have North America, which is going to be the United States and Canada. Then we have Middle America, which is going to be between North and South America, which includes a lot of the Caribbean islands and Mexico, down into Panama, etc. Then we have the South America region. We also have Europe over here, Russia, North Africa, and Southwest Asia. So again, these are vernacular, not necessarily boundaries. So these regions actually go together. We'll talk more about why as we get to those. And then that's separated then from the Sub-Sahara Africa. And then Asia gets divided up into South Asia. We're going to separate out East Asia and then talk about South Asia. And then ending with Oceania, which is part of Australia and the Pacific Islands. All right, a few more things here just to kind of wrap up this chapter. So some other terminology that we'll see. So globalization and inequality. We'll talk about this a lot as we go through the different regions. So globalization is one way that we can see how the world is related by this regional geography. So globalization is just the interconnectedness of the world, and we see this so much with the economy. So if China's economy starts to decline, then ours kind of domino effects into that, or vice versa. So as one country becomes more industrialized and can provide a service, that increases the success of other countries through trade and that type of thing. So that interconnectedness is referred to as globalization. Unfortunately, inequality also can go along with that. So again, one of the main reasons, if we think about globalization and importing goods and services from China and Thailand and Vietnam, the reason that we do that is because of the inequality that exists in those regions where they have poor, labor laws. Again, we think about like child labor, which is poor working environments. So they can produce things much cheaper than what we can due to that inequality. So we'll kind of see this showing up in multiple regions as we go through. So again, where's the world's poorest countries? Why are they currently poor? These are the questions that kind of subdiscipline of geography looks at. So if we kind of look at, again, those living in extreme poverty, we start to see, again, Africa, of course, being the most extreme in the poverty level, up to 100% poverty. Our more industrialized nations, of course, the United States has a much lower. It doesn't mean there are not individuals living in extreme poverty, but just as a percentage, much less than what we see in other parts of the world. All right, another one that we'll look at in your first assignment actually focuses on this is ethnocentrism. So this is our biases, so judging other people or cultures based on our own standards. So this is kind of with an emphasis on our own culture's superiority. And this can happen within a country. So the United States individuals from the US looking, down or having biases to like the Middle East or to other countries. It can be by regions, so again, North and South, with different cultures. So this occurs in multiple different areas, not just like country to country, but even within a region. So again, some examples. So how do parts of the US, so like California and New York, view West Virginia in general? So that's an example of this ethnocentrism. So this affects how we see culture. So as we go through, these different regions, we'll start to see some of this. So this can affect our assumptions about the places that we live, that we go to, or that we want to visit or work in. So this cartoon here sadly shows a lot of our ethnocentrism that can exist within different regions about how we view individuals coming in to our areas. So of course, oftentimes the native individuals are those who are most suffer the most inequality. But again, that superiority that leads to this ethnocentrism. So again, this is something we want to keep in mind as we learn about the various regions. So again, we all have biases. So again, the idea of talking about ethnocentrism is to understand we all have it. So as we go through these regions, just kind of checking that and identifying the assumptions we have and looking at those. All right, so that initial conception assignment that's due very soon, that's the idea, is just kind of thinking about these different regions. What do we know about them? What are some of the assumptions that we may have? And the idea is just to help us to be more open-minded about unfamiliar cultural practices. So different foods that they may eat, their rituals. Again, we think about arranged marriages. So again, we have different assumptions, and the idea is just kind of checking those as we move throughout these regions. All right, so just kind of wrapping up here. So looking at the economy and geography. So economic geography, again, another subdiscipline here. This is looking at studies of economic activity through the spatial lens, so differences in resources that are consumed, where they're produced, how they're allocated, to looking at, is it a communist, is it more a market-based economy? So supply and demand, that type of thing. So all of that makes up our geographic or economic geography. So this is kind of showing our map here. We go back again to the core, which are more industrialized. This is on a global scale. So of course, North America and Canada, we have Europe, and then Australia is another important part, as well as some of our Asian countries. That's again that core that we have that allows a lot of the economy to be based, but they're supported then by the periphery or the hinterland or the semi-periphery, the other countries that help to aid that. And it all makes up that global economy. So some of these economic systems, again, a little video about these that you can watch, but this is how they get organized and distribute their resources. So comparing governments and societies. So who is regulating what's being produced and distributed as far as labor laws, who's regulating their natural resources. So there are many different decision-making processes. So who's making those? Is it the companies? Is it the government? Kind of who's in charge of those? So these get based on, again, just basic features as far as, again, supply and demand, also distinguishing characteristics of what makes the systems different, and then the conditions and assumptions. So these types of systems, so the traditional economic system is kind of a bartering. So it's the most basic. There's no government involved. So this is very rarely seen, at least in most regions. So these would be more small communities. So their customs and traditions, they're more about bartering, so trading more than using cash or buying things. So again, some kind of tribal communities may still, use this more traditional, but it's again not seen very frequently in most regions. So our subsistence is just the making what is needed. So that's all that they just make what they need. They use it. They trade what they have in excess. So again, the hunter-gatherer kind of societies. Then we have the command or planned economy. So their central control here and authority makes those economic decisions. So the government or the ruler is in charge of that. They determine the rate of production, so what gets made, the prices of that, the wages, again, thinking about labor market. So their own means of production. So the facilities are making the commodities. So socialism and communism, especially think about communism, again, the government is controlling the majority of everything. Who's making what, who owns the businesses, what they can make, how much they pay, all that good stuff. Then the market economy, this is more where we are at. So the market force dictates the price. So we think about like supply and demand. So if we need it more, then the price goes up. So there's little or no government regulation that's involved as far as pricing. So profit and competition is what drives the prices. A pure market is really theoretical. Usually you kind of have like a little bit of a mix. We'll talk about it next. Because again, the government, whether directly or indirectly, has some impact on that economy. So a pure market is very theoretical. So private individuals or company are who is going to own the resources rather than the government that we just had seen in the command. So capitalism is an example of this. And then we can have kind of this mixed or dual to where we kind of have bits and pieces of both. So it's a combination of, again, market and command economies. So those are the most common ones. So we have private industry, but we also have public services. So we, again, have this type of, is what we see. So we have our own companies that make a lot of goods and determine the prices, but we also have government involved in healthcare and public services and involved in the labor market and that type of thing. All right, so again, the government is involved, but they don't completely own or dictate it. So we have different quotas, tariffs, and subsidies. So again, that would be taxes that are put on different things, whether we're importing or exporting, and that impacts then the economy. All right, so that wraps up our introduction. A little longer chapter this time, just hitting on all these different things. Most of our chapters won't be quite so long now that we've introduced all these different concepts.